In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation magazine readers, Sublation media viewers, Sublation Sublated, all of you out there who are watching. It is I, Douglas Lain.
And I'm Ashley Frawley.
We are here with this week's Sublation magazine. We're going to be talking to Chris Cutrone in just a moment. But we are going to start off by reminding you what the topic is this week. We are talking about the subject. So the subject is the subject.
It's not the week. It's not this week. This is our month.
It's the whole month. Sorry, for the whole month.
Yeah.
The subject has been the subject.
Yeah. So we've been going through different ideas of why the left has a problem with subjectivity, how this feeds into different ways that we think about progress and social movements. And then I did a diet soap interview with David Chandler to get a sense of how neoliberalism or post-liberalism constructs the subject, and that this becomes a kind of, contrary to popular belief, it's not that neoliberalism rehashes a liberal subject, a liberal enlightenment subject. It's the destruction of the subject. It is through these kinds of like post-structural, everything is just fluid and horizontal, and it's all about people's cultural things. This is how capitalism now operates. And that was the idea that I wanted to get across in that particular episode. And then I used the example of like how it's used to kind of justify global inequalities as sort of natural to particular types of people. There's no more universal human subject. There's only particularity. So it's okay for Ukraine to be rebuilt. And in fact, it becomes this site of all this investment of new, I was listening to Times Radio. I listen to Times Radio all day. It's one of my rotation stations. And there's an advertisement all day long that's like, Ukraine is strong. Ukraine is open for business. It's become this place where it's like sopping up investment. Whereas, so they're repairing buildings while there's still a war zone. Whereas Liberia had a civil war 30 years ago and its infrastructure never recovered. And they're building like just little roads for motorcycles to go by. Because these are not because there's obviously a lot going on here, but there is just two different kinds of people. Right? There's just difference. There's no universal human. There's no sense that all humanity is doing something. It's all particularity. And it's all, well, these people need this, and that's okay for them. And these people need that, and that's okay for them. It's just all these different needs. So it's okay for someone somewhere to have just a goat and a motorbike maybe, or to use tools and small scale machinery. That's okay for them. That becomes almost like a naturalization of their poverty. But then if it's white people, then it is, well, this is bad. And, if you see white people in poverty, you're like, oh my God. If you see Black people in poverty, it's like, oh no, that's nature. So we have this destruction of the universal subject that becomes just about particular subjects with particular needs. And this is part of the logic of global capitalism now. That was my goal with that. It was a little bit ambiguous because Chandler, I think, used to be very, very critical and very, very kind of similar to me in the sense that he's kind of questioning this construction of the vulnerable subject and like the reification of that how that's become naturalized, human vulnerability and the inability to self-govern and that kind of thing. He used to be quite critical. I think over time, he's become a lot more ambivalent and descriptive and maybe pessimistic about the ability for the subject to actually be rehashed, that it's just like gone now. Whereas I'm a lot more optimistic. But if you hated everything that he said, that's good. I'm glad, because my point was that is how we are invited to think about humanity now and about how capitalism works. That's like very mainstream. And it sounds radical and progressive, but it's not. So I was actually very heartened by the fact that people really reacted against that. Because usually it sounds really progressive. And people go, oh yeah, difference and cultural difference and so on. But this is actually being used against us to justify and reify global inequality.
Well, I
And keeping with where we are generally in capitalism, there's just there's many different capitalisms, and that's there's no beyond this. It's what are we even talking about here? That kind of thing. That's what's used to kind of keep us down, hold us back. Sorry, go ahead, Doug.
I watched the interview twice, and a couple of things struck me. One is that he was describing a change in the way that we ideologically approach understanding human beings and society. He was talking about the death of liberal modernity. That is the death of the idea that what we are dealing with are free individuals who are then, democratically deciding together how society should run. And he was also reluctant, because he was critical of the society that emerged after the death of modernity. He was reluctant to propose any kind of politics or any remedy to this dilemma of the death of the subject, because he didn't want to participate in reproducing the neoliberal order. That's what I came to understand was going on. He was profoundly negative, but he didn't have the affect of someone who had been defeated or like he was depressed, but just that he was digging in his heels and saying, no, we don't just rush off to reinvent modernity. We can't do it. We don't. But what was missing for me was any explanation as to how we arrived at, let's say, this postmodern moment, or why the ideology of resilience or postmodernity had taken hold so deeply. And that's one of the things I'm hoping, but I don't know, that Chris Cutrone might start to explain, or at least have something to say about it.
Yeah, so this is what we want to do. We're going to round out this month by giving a sense of how do we go forward. Okay, we've gone through the subject, and I tried to put forward a more, totally unnuanced kind of like, yes, let's rehash the subject. And then we had Chandler kind of saying, we can't just do that. And I said, that sounds like apathy. Is there not a middle ground? And Chris messaged me and said, I think I do have a middle ground. And that's what we wanted to talk about today.
Okay. So, all right, Chris Cutrone, track coach and the last Marxist and the author of The Death of the Millennial Left. We should announce right now that your book is at the printer. It's going to be premiered at the Platypus Affiliated Society conference this coming weekend. That's in Chicago.
Yeah, right? The International Convention. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And you're going to be featured this week on Diet Soap. Then Derek Varn and I are going to take you to pieces over your Why Not Trump essay. Not at all, actually, but on Friday. But I'm very excited to be publishing you, Chris, and your book is terrific, and people should, as soon as we make it available for pre-order on the website, which should be very soon, people should pre-order it.
Very exciting.
Welcome, Chris.
Hi.
Hey. So what did you think of the Chandler interview? What inspired you to reach out to us?
Well, I mean, I had a very kind of subjective experience of it, I have to say, which is that I started out, he made a very convincing case for, why this shift towards resiliency and relations rather than, subjects. And I just felt like a pit in my stomach. I felt like a kind of a dread kind of come over me, like, what if this is the world that we're living in, where we're just nodes in a network, rather than agents. And then it became clear, actually, that I don't know his background at all, but he seemed like someone who maybe had spent some time on the sectarian left, maybe an ex-Trotskyist.
Exactly, yeah.
Then he came around to like Adorno, and he said, well, if Adorno said that you can't take action in 1968, how much more true is it today, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, that's true, that's fine. But again, this question of the next step or a missing step or the middle ground, and I thought, actually, I do have some ideas about that, and I've actually been pursuing those ideas precisely in this Trump era, like since 2015 in the Bernie era, in the Trump era, but it's not through platypus, it's through something else, the Campaign for a Socialist Party. And, it's a very slow burn. It's a very kind of back burner now kind of project because I formulated it before Bernie. And so I feel like a lot of the energy went into Bernie and went into like Corbyn and, Momentum, because I did feel like there is this huge gap, right? There's sort of capitalist politics, and then there is the sectarian left, and the DSA, Jacobin, Bhaskar Sankara definitely is trying to fill that gap, but in a particular way, right? Towards the Democratic Party and towards a kind of progressive reformism. And, we've talked around the edges of this, you and I, Doug, many times about like, what a kind of real socialist politics might look like and how to build towards it, that it might look like anarchism, that it's not going to look, the way people think about Marxism. It's not going to be like a Leninist vanguard party, at least not to begin with. It may not be a political party at all. And, it might look very much like the left looks in other respects, like affinity groups and this kind of thing. But it's also going to look like things that we don't associate with the left at all, like religious organizations, churches, and even like gangs, like the black market, the gray economy. It's going to look like things that, again, I used to talk about in terms of like civil social organizing. And, people are allergic to that because they hear that and they're like, oh, that's neoliberal NGOism. Right? Because it's kind of become that. But as opposed to what? Meaning it sounds like neoliberal privatization, NGOism, by contrast with the Fordist state, with the kind of bureaucratic state. So the idea is that the government has like outsourced a lot of things that it used to do in the middle 20th century, and it's done so under these like, basically privatized quasi-governmental, you were talking about the Twitter files, Doug, right? And how pernicious it is. It's because it's the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security doing this censorship, but through these paragovernmental NGO, like they set up these private companies to do it. Right. And I was looking for a new show to watch, and Kiefer Sutherland, who did 24, which I really love that show, by the way. He has a new show called The Rabbit Hole, and he's a private intelligence agent, private intelligence contractor. So he works for the intelligence services, but he works for a private company that does the government. So people think that, right? They think, oh, this is like, civil society mongering, sounds very neoliberal. But for me, of course, it goes all the way back to Marx, and it goes back to the questions of like the 19th century, like social action and political action. And Marxism has tended to say you need both social action and political action. But I think today, political action sounds like electoralism. It sounds like, who do you vote for? And a party sounds like, well, you start a party so that people can vote for it in elections. And it's like, well, no, that's not the assumption at all. Right. So just to begin with. But
let's walk through this. So someone in the chat asked, could someone explicate sectarian left? Is this a euphemism?
No, it's a pejorative. It's a horrible pejorative, right? It's like a nasty. I pause before saying that because, of course, we are all sectarian leftists in a way, even if we're just sects of one, right? Like academic leftists end up being what Mike McNair of the Communist Party of Great Britain called sects of one. And so sectarianism it's an old language. It's like the two dangers, like Rosa Luxemburg used to talk about this, and Lenin and other people used to talk about this. Kautsky used to talk about this. The dangers are you don't want to be an opportunist and liquidate into capitalist politics, but you also don't want to end up just being an isolated sect.
Yep. And what is the difference? I mean, what defines your isolation? How do you know that you're isolated as a sect? If what aren't you participating in if you're a sect that you
Well,
would
you've lost
be?
contact with the masses. You've lost contact with the working class. Like these kinds of things, right? And then I think that the language that Ashley and David Chandler were getting into a little bit was like the subject and the revolutionary subject and that kind of thing. And it's kind of like the class as a subject. And I think that was the other thing that David Chandler talked about that I found very interesting. He said, look, it's not like the working class is not a literal subject. It's a figurative subject. In other words, it's a subject to become, not a subject that's just there, ready-made, that already is. Right. And I thought, well, okay, there's a lot kind of packed into that. Since I mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, there's a film by Margareta von Trotta, the Rosa Luxemburg film from like many years ago when I saw it when I was in college, Doug. It was from 1986. It came to the United States a little bit later than that. And they show the leader of the SPD, the Social Democrats of Germany, at the 1900 New Year's party, right? And he gives a rousing speech. He says, the class-conscious proletariat enters the 20th century with high hopes. So what is that class-conscious proletariat? It's the party. It's him. It's them. It's the party, right? It's not like the workers, the working class. It's the party, it's the class-conscious proletariat. And that gets very tricky. It gets very tricky because it's like, well, who the hell are these guys? Are they workers? Are they intellectuals? What are we talking about? Like, who is the revolutionary subject? And it's all well and good that Marxism has this like figurative notion of the working class as revolutionary subject, not literal, but figurative, that they should be the revolutionary subject. They have to become the revolutionary subject. They aren't simply the revolutionary subject as they are. And, the Lenin trade union consciousness versus socialist consciousness, which is actually a Kautsky thing and is actually Marx. Marx has that too. So, what do we mean? And also, how do we build that subject? Because the subject isn't already there. It isn't there, right? We're not talking about a subject that exists, right?
Well, I guess my question is, how can you avoid sectarianism when you don't have a mass party, you don't have a self-conscious proletariat, and all that your options would be to connect to the masses would be to go through various forms of capital or capitalist politics or bourgeois politics. So you try to, if you're connecting to the masses as masses, you could be connected to them through the mass media. You could be connecting to them through union organizations. You could be connecting to them through NGOs. And those are the ways in which are already existing to
this is
have
what I wanted
some
to talk
political
about
impact.
today,
Right,
with you guys. So I want to talk about like the gap or the missing step or the middle ground, because my sense of it, and this has to do with both being an activist on the left when I was in college and before that when I was in high school, but also after that when I quit the left, because I quit the left 30 years ago. In 1993, I quit the left, and I never really rejoined it. I quit it. But I then was around Adolf Reed's Labor Party project, which was a bunch of sectarians, there's a bunch of Trotskyists and Maoists trying to start a labor party. And I was like, yeah, this ain't going anywhere. And I said, why aren't you just starting a socialist party? And it's like, that's sectarian, that's Trotskyism, that's sectarianism. And I was like, okay, whatever, God bless.
Right, because they wanted to fit within the really existing politics of the world at that time.
But they didn't want to challenge. The funny thing about the Labor Party, about Adolf Reed's Labor Party, is that he didn't want to challenge. He didn't want to run in a way that could cause the Democrats to lose. And so it's like, okay, well, then what are you doing? And that's the point. My sense of it is that actually, even though it seems like as soon as you do anything, you're immediately in the ambit of capitalist politics, that in fact, there's a whole wide open field of social reality out there that actually is not touched by capitalist politics. So a problem that we have on the left, and I'm like the old-fashioned Marxist, like total, right? And yet I'm going to say something paradoxical, which is that we see the world through a certain set of blinders. We see the world as it was seen like 30 or even 50 years ago. So the model of activism, of social action, and of political action is stuck in the past. In other words, we don't see the world as it actually is. We see it as it was.
Back in the New Left era, in the 60s.
Back in the New Left era. In other words, the last time there really was an attempt to engage reality in an authentic way, and why they had to be a new left, is that they realized the 30s way of doing it wasn't appropriate anymore. And then they did things like the Students for a Democratic Society. They did the ERAP program, where they like went to the people. They had their kind of go to the people moment. The Black Panthers had this in terms of like community organizing. And of course, like Adolf's very good at showing how community organizing, radical community organizing, became a new way of constituency building for the Democratic Party. Right. So a lot of Black Panthers became Democrats, like Bobby Rush here in Chicago, who has endorsed the conservative candidate for mayor here, as he always does. He endorsed Rahm Emanuel. Now he's endorsing Paul Vallis against Brandon Johnson, who's the socialist, who's the teachers union guy. Bobby Rush, Black Panther, right? So they did these things, but we really haven't tried to do that. What happened in the 80s, what happened in our time, Doug, was that the left really retreated into protest demonstration type stuff and not really organizing at all. And the organizing was then done by the liberals or by the anarchists, by the liberals kind of above ground and by the anarchists underground. And then the old new left kind of infiltrated the Democratic Party. The Maoists all became like progressive Democrat supporters. They ran the Harold Washington campaign for mayor here in Chicago. And they joined the Democrats, and they worked their way up through the labor unions and became part of the labor union bureaucracy. The Teamsters for a Democratic Union is all Maoists. That's what they did. And so my sense is that what's been neglected in the meantime is everything that's changed. And the left has played a kind of conservative role. It's tried to kind of hold on to basically the way things were done in the 60s, but also the kind of opposition that they had. Like the sort of like they were opposed to the Democrats, but more opposed to the Republicans. But the way they conceived of all of that is sort of built into our notions of what leftism is today at an activist level. I mean, it's
Right.
gotten worse
And
than
just
that.
to clarify, when you're protesting against, I don't know, let's say fracking or a war,
yeah,
or whatever you're protesting against, what you're doing is demonstrating that there's a segment of the electorate that sides with you on an issue, and you're demonstrating that primarily to the Democratic Party, I think.
Yeah, and nowadays we've lived long enough to see something really strange happen, like the Caleb Maupins of the world. And, where they've decided that the Republicans under Trump are now the progressive bourgeoisie with which to have a united front against the reactionary bourgeoisie who are now the Democrats. Right. So you can always do that, too. Right. And it's kind of like, so it doesn't matter which party. The point is that what needs to happen, and this is where it's really, I would call it pre-political. The left is in a pre-political condition, meaning we have to organize and act, and really we need to explore social reality. I mean, this is where, like, I don't know, Ashley, like sociology, it's kind of like we have to be, and the SDS did this in the early 60s. We have to be like participant observers, ethnographers, sociologists. We have to go and figure out what is reality, like how are people actually living? What is their actual relationship to capitalism and the state and all? We can't assume anything, because in fact, all of those assumptions are wrong because they're dated. And we don't really have, like, it's not just contact with the working class or the people or the masses. We don't have contact with social reality. We see it through a kind of mediatized version, which is obviously completely untrue. And then we have this, and as intellectuals, we do think of it as like an intellectual problem or even as an aesthetic problem. How do we feel about it? How does it appear to us? What are its imagery? This kind of thing. Whereas I just feel like actually we don't even know what we're dealing with. So here in Chicago, the Campaign for a Socialist Party that I was working on, that I started and was working with, we tried to kind of get involved in anti-police brutality kind of activism. And it's kind of like, what are the police to people, right? If we just have this idea that the police are what they were for the Black Panthers in 1969, we're going to really miss a lot, because things have changed a great deal, right? And it's not like they've changed, they've gotten worse, they've gotten better. It's just configured differently at a concrete level. And so you just can't presume anything. And in the meantime, they've set up like community review boards and all sorts of accountability, and they have like bureaucratic mechanisms. How do you make complaints? You know, they've set up this whole apparatus, and it seems like, oh, as soon as you do anything, you're immediately part of that. But in fact, people on the ground do deal with it differently and independently of any of that. So
to go back to Chandler, he was aiming his critique and his exploration of ideas at the NGO statist ideology, I think, right? And he was doing that under the presumption that social reality was completely subsumed by the power of these institutions. Is that right, do you think? Or
because there wasn't a constituted political opposition. Right. So I looked him up, you know, like after watching your talk with him, Ashley, I looked him up and I was like, oh, he's doing all this very, what I would consider to be anodyne kind of research, you know, around resiliency and whatever. So he's just, you know, he's just going with, you know, like, okay, this is how people talk about things now. And, you know, he's willing to engage it at that level. And that looks like a total capitulation. And, you know, it is kind of, right? It's a kind of a policy discourse, whether in terms of government policy or in terms of private corporate policy. And it's like, it's fine, right? Because he's trying to sort of dig behind it. Like, in other words, he's kind of going with it in order to be like, well, but what does it mean? And in this conversation with you, Ashley, he's like, actually, a lot of the rhetoric started out meaning one thing in the beginning, you know, like with the Thatcher era. And now it means the diametrical opposite of what it originally meant.
Yeah,
right?
like resilience.
Language, right? The same jargon, the same like categories, and that this has happened sort of imperceptibly through the very kind of policies and institutions that were set up, right? And he brought up Amartya Sen, you know, the economist, and, you know, these different ways, who is a kind of a lefty kind of person. And we have to remember that neoliberalism, even though it's associated with Thatcher and Reagan, neoliberalism comes out of the quote unquote left. It comes out of the Democratic Party.
Yeah. I was going to say, it sounds really lefty, right? But the more you dig down into it, the more it's like quite a static kind of view of like hunting around in reactionary Aristotelianism stuff.
Well,
that sounds.
Oh, let's not do that, right? I suddenly flashed on Benjamin Studebaker. Do you know who he is?
Yeah.
Vaguely,
Yeah.
He's a co-host of What's Left, or used to be. Now he's another podcast.
And he's a very interesting person, but he has this idea that you're either a Platonist or an Aristotelian, and the Aristotelians are responsible for everything bad in the world. And like, no. You don't have to do that. You know what I mean? It's sort of maybe the opposite of like Karl Popper or something. Like Plato is everything good and Aristotle is everything bad. And I think Popper would say Plato's everything bad and Aristotle's everything good or something. It's like the reverse also. Plato's like the idealist, Aristotle's like the materialist, whatever. So let's not quite do that, because it's not like an intellectual method point, I don't think, right? I mean, you know what I was thinking of also? It's kind of like, was Foucault pro-neoliberal or anti-neoliberal? You know, like his lectures, the famous lectures on neoliberalism, right? It's like, is he endorsing it? Is he criticizing it? I kind of feel like he's saying, what's going on here? You know? And I feel like David Chandler's doing that. And that's a good impulse. It is a good impulse, especially for an academic. I mean, what else are you going to do? You know, like, what's really going on here? It's not like you can say, oh no, this language has got a political agenda, and just no, we have to be opposed to it as such, right? But anyway, I think that a socialist politics is obviously not going to be based on an academic investigation of social reality. It's going to have to be based on so-called activism, which is fraught with problems. But again, if we think of it as like social action, organizing people and really learning what people's lives are like and what their capacities are for organizing themselves, at a very like basic level, like just going in. I mean, the way that I put it is with the Campaign for a Socialist Party. So I mentioned Brandon Johnson, who, it's so funny, he spoke on a platypus panel a few years back, and now he's running for mayor of Chicago. And at the platypus panel, he used a formulation that I then used in my Campaign for a Socialist Party. He said, the problem is that the left is heard in the community, but it's not seen in the community. Meaning everybody hears this, leftist rhetoric, there are these protests and there are these leftists and they say these things, but then they're not actually there. And I said, we have to do the opposite, right? We have to be like good little children. We have to be seen, but not heard. Meaning we're not—
I was going to say, right? Jesus, God forbid the left is fucking seen and heard in the community. That's like the worst.
Well, right. No, but the thing is, the reason that we might not want to be heard is that what do we have to say, really? Except for some like crackpot ideology. Like, what do we have to say to ordinary people?
Yeah, that's my concern when I'm listening to this. It just sounds so like outsiders being like, oh, let's go down to the little people and let's go see and like watch them in their natural habitats. That's
First of all, I'm a little person. First of all, I am a little person, meaning I think of it, like I'm married to a non-leftist. My family are not all leftists.
No, I'm married to a non-intellectual.
And I'm married to a non-intellectual. He's educated, but not like an overeducated fool like I am. And my family is not educated, in this way. They're innocent of this stuff, really. They only get it as filtered through the mainstream culture. And I just think, what would this mean to them? What does this mean to my husband? What does this mean to my mother, my father, my brother, my sister-in-law? What is it going to mean to my niece and nephew? Like their crazy uncle, the Marxist? Like who's Uncle Chris? Oh, he's a college professor, but he's also this crazy Marxist who people hate online. I'm like, who? To my cousins, who is this guy, Chris Cutrone? What the fuck? He's a Marxist, right? And meanwhile, they're all pretty conservative. So I always think of it in terms of like, what do I have to say to them? Yeah. What would I have to say to them? And actually, I have a lot to say to people. In other words, I can talk to anybody about anything. When I went to Malaysia with Fazell, his father used to be police, and in a place like Malaysia, police are like paramilitary. And he, a lot of his friends, they're like government employees. And I, met one of his college friends who came by to see him off, who was on his way to the Thai border, and he was in an unmarked car, but he was like a military guy, right? And he came and we had breakfast, him and his dudes, and they were kind of like a paramilitary death squad. Definitely, they were going to the Thai border to find like drug smugglers, and they deal very harshly with them in Malaysia. And he wanted to know about Trump. He said, why are Americans voting for Trump? And and he's a Muslim, a devout Muslim, like almost an Islamist. I can talk to anybody about anything, Doug. He's definitely like, this guy was definitely like a homophobe. Like, it was like, me and Fazell are married, but we didn't talk about that. It's like, oh, Fazell's friend. And it was just understood. Oh, yeah, of course, they're a gay couple, but we're not going to say it. Right?
Right.
Because I'm just not there to say this is a fucking homophobic country.
No, that's not the point.
The books, right? There's just no point, right? And so you got to be able to deal with people. Can leftists deal with people? No.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Well, maybe not as leftists, but I think we all have the capacity. But
what I was going to say is that was kind of the thing that was worrying me, is that when you said like, not the working class, not as it is. And I understood that from my understanding, you mean like working class through the process of like, I don't know, organizing itself, becomes conscious of itself, right? Mm-hmm. And but what that became was like precisely this walk toward neoliberalism, where the understanding was the reason why we didn't have a revolution was because the working class, there was something wrong with them. They were not adequately, aware of their own interests. Maybe they voted against their own interests or acted against their own interests, but they needed to be reformed in some way, that the working class subject needed to be rehabilitated, and that we would never have progress until the working class subject had reached a sufficient level of self-efficacy or something like that.
It's education. It's what they would call
kind of NGO class kind of thing. That's why I was a bit worried when you were saying that.
Well,
but I was
like,
very glad to hear you say, like, well, we just deal with people and it's not about reforming their subjectivity. Oh, but aren't you homophobic? We can't have a conversation until that's dealt with.
Right. And so, Ashley, you're a teacher. I'm a teacher. So Doug's not a teacher, but you and I are teachers. So we educate the children, right?
No, yeah, but I want to also explain, I don't have any books on my shelves because I write at
You made
home.
room for all my books that are coming out this year.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's right.
There might be 4. There's like one from there's one on my art writings by a small publisher, Caesura Publication. 2 from Sublation, maybe even a 3rd if I finish The Dictatorship of the Proletariat.
Yeah,
sometime.
you got to do that.
No, I am. So what I was going to say is we're educators, right, Ashley? And I think that people have this idea of education, and God knows what our colleagues think about education. But it's not like we fill the kids' heads with ideas or something. They ultimately have to learn it for themselves.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, I'm a very like strong teacher. Like I definitely say this is that, like this is the case, this is what the text says. But they still have to figure out the meaning for themselves. Right? I can do all that. But, I don't do this kind of like just walk into the classroom. Oh, what do we all think of this thing that I had you read? Right? I do say, no, this is how you should see it. This is the background. These are the ideas. Like, this is how you read it. But then they have to do it for themselves. So I think the people get freaked out. I mean, obviously, the people who are going to make socialism happen, they do need to be educated, but they do have to educate themselves, meaning they do have to learn for themselves in the end. And it's not going to be like we can come in with a set of ideas and then we're going to like lead them by the nose and then they're going to see the efficacy of the ideas. I kind of feel like at this point where we are politically, in a very pre-political moment, in an organizing moment, actually would not be like, oh, this is what's wrong with capitalism and this and that. It would not be that. Not to begin with, because it would be very light on the ideas because the ideas are unmotivated. Like there's no like need for like a Marxist idea. Like why are, everyday people, why would they find Marxism very strange? Because they don't need it. Like it doesn't serve a purpose for them.
Okay, so I want to question that assumption a little bit because I don't feel like my own story of being drawn to the left is unique. Exactly.
You're an intellectual though, Doug.
Yeah,
it's a big difference. I mean, if you're
I
an
love how
intellectual,
you're accusing him of being an intellectual when we are both university professors.
He was a writer.
Yeah.
There are many ways of being intellectual.
I know, but it was just funny.
Yeah, I mean,
oh, Doug, you're
and
an
the other
intellectual.
thing is that professors might be the most anti-intellectual people of all.
Oh,
Yeah.
Jesus, you're right about
Well,
that.
like,
right?
but so the reason I became, let's say I became an intellectual and I wanted to become a writer, it was because I wanted to be somebody. I was trying, it came to me as
The
to
psychological narcissism, sure, but
well, no, but you say it's narcissism, maybe it is, but it's also, when you come of age, when you are a teenager and you are trying to fit into the world and grow up and leave home, you have to individuate, you have to become somebody, you have to figure
you found
out
an ego ideal in writing.
Right. Yeah, but the point is that it became
As an
difficult.
artist.
Yeah, it became difficult to figure out how to be somebody in the world as it was without opposing the world in some way. And and I don't think that's just unique to me as a so-called intellectual. I think that kids especially, go through that feeling of needing to oppose the world and not finding a place for themselves in it.
I'm not saying that workers can't be intellectuals. Of course they can be. They often are in their...
Of course, the best of them, actually.
Right?
Right.
And, but again, it's kind of like, is that what we want to do? Talk to workers and like get them into like theory or something? Like, no. Like, in other words, what really needs to be done is people need to be educated in how to take action and how to organize themselves. Again, the social action idea. But
the danger there is that the most practical things to do as an individual to take action to defend your rights would be to figure out the bureaucracy, become legalistic, and and
that's what the 60s generation did, by the way. So the ERAP programs that
Right.
like went to the people and like figured out what was going on, they became their kind of legal advocates, claiming their rights and their benefits from the bureaucracy. And that had a strategy to it, because they're trying to like bankrupt the welfare state in order to bring about socialism, right? They were like, oh, actually, they discovered, because who would have known? They discovered, oh, the welfare state is based on the fact that a lot of people don't claim their benefits. If everybody who is entitled to claim their benefits did claim them, it would bankrupt the whole system. And so let's do that.
Right.
But meanwhile, we've been kind of sleepwalking. Like since then, like honest leftists do become these kinds of like advocates vis-a-vis the welfare state. And they don't understand the strategy of that was to produce a crisis of the welfare state. It wasn't simply to expand the welfare state, right? It was actually to precipitate a crisis, because in fact, the leftists of the time thought that the welfare state was bad. They thought that it was a way of controlling people. They thought that it was, demobilizing, depoliticizing, de-radicalizing, that it treated people as objects, which of course it does do. So they weren't like in trying to engage it. So today, for example, like the other thing that the Campaign for a Socialist Party, so we did some anti-police brutality kind of organizing, but then also tenant organizing, right? And it's kind of like, yes, people should deal with things. They should. And they should also deal with things in a way that is not like confronting. Like it's not to make like a kind of a spectacle. It's not to like get a viral video of like, some public meeting where you denounce the bureaucrat.
That shouldn't be always the way you go anyway. I mean, there might be a time and a place for it.
There might be a time and a place for it, but not to begin with. Again, to begin with, it's going to look very unpolitical, actually. Which is to say, of course, but the thing is, what should people do that is independent? What can they do that's independent of any law or policy or government agency that exists? Right? In other words, that isn't dependent on, we need this administrative policy instead of that administrative policy. We need this law instead of that law. We need to get back to like old leftism. So another example that came up, one of our members like was happy to discover an old feminist group from the 70s that had already been around a while by the 70s that, they used to like facilitate providing abortion to people when it was illegal. Right. And in other words, that, we're just going to do this. We're not waiting for the law to change. Right. We're not trying to elect someone who's going to have a better administrative policy or a better law. We're going to do what's necessary now. Now, the thing is, and neoliberalism is a funny thing with respect to this. Both the preceding form, Fordism, and the neoliberal form, capitalism, not everything is legal. Not everything is actually regulated or bureaucratized or legal. A lot of what goes on is in the kind of gray zone. It's kind of quasi-legal. And that's part of the nature of bourgeois society and bourgeois law. There is a difference between like social reality and the law. And the idea is that you want to, if the law is at odds too much with social reality, then you want to change the law to bring it in line with social reality. But it's understood that social reality isn't like created by the law. It's not created by administrative policy, because it really isn't. And so therefore, a lot of what goes on in capitalism is like outside of that framework. And in neoliberalism especially, a lot of the economy is gray economy and an even black market economy. I mean, and thinking of this, by the way, so you think, I'm in the United States, so we can think of it as like a first world perspective. But I really think that we have to understand this as something that's universally true no matter what country you're in. Right? If you're in Africa, if you're in India, if you're in Western Europe, if you're in Mexico, you're in Canada, if you're in the United States, what should people be doing regardless? Right? And so, because the situation is not as different on the ground in terms of like working class organizing as we might think. In other words, the sort of everyday reality, doesn't depend. Like, we might think that we're in this kind of boxed in bureaucratic something or other, But I mean, the funny thing is that the administrative state, like even the Frankfurt School gets pegged with this notion. That they're talking about like the integrated state, the administered society, but their sense of that actually was that was a contradiction. In other words, that the society can't be administered, actually. And any attempt to administer it is itself self-contradictory and produces bad results. I mean, this is, the rational kernel of a kind of right-wing, anti-government kind of thing, the libertarian, or even just the Ronald Reagan, like the 9 scariest words are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. Right? Like there's a rational kernel to that, right? So when we think of like a hyper-administered, bureaucratized, statified society, actually that society is also a society of unaccountability, corruption, lawlessness. It's like I wanted to say, I mean, I didn't get a chance to say this when we were talking to Conrad Hamilton about like China. He thinks that China is great. The problem with China is that it's not that it's a monolithic society in which everything is controlled. The problem with China is that it has an unaccountable bureaucracy in which there's a great deal of corruption, and in which policies are administered very arbitrarily based on jockeying for position within the bureaucracy, within the Chinese Communist Party. It's hyper opportunistic, super corrupt. That's the problem.
Yeah,
right?
I was just about to throw this on the screen myself, Ashley.
Because
Go ahead.
I have, sorry,
Let's keep it
Sean,
there.
I have notes where I kept saying, no, but this is what I think is probably going to happen. That why I have to admit, when I hear this kind of like, how can we connect with people? How can we? I feel like both the party political and the hey, let's do some grassroots stuff are both dead. And when I don't know.
That's true.
But
No,
I
that's true.
feel that it seems to me that these things are dead and they don't speak to people, and it's just like a bunch of people screaming at
On the left, it's dead, but people are still doing that stuff. Just not.
Yeah, but here's the difference. What I think will happen is that there will be movements of workers who are pushed to the edge. And this is what happens. You always remember in the German ideology, Marx and Engels write something like, the masses aren't waiting with bated breath the resolution of theoretical questions.
Right.
They are living the problem, and they find solutions in there. Because when you cannot eat, you will fucking do something, right? And this is what and you can't, and not just eat, but like when you live in a civilization and you're deprived of civilization, this will push people out, and they will find a solution. And this is what the French workers are doing. This is what the truckers were doing. But I think this is what's going to happen, is that we're going to see these movements. And because we are so disoriented, and the left has been overrun by neoliberalism and culture wars, and it's not working class people, it's going to get smeared. Anything that rises up is going to get smeared, and this is interesting.
How are they smearing the French workers who are demanding that the age of retirement isn't raised to 67?
Anytime that you want to smear any kind of movement, it's just watch for how it's like, well, these people are racist.
They're white.
These people are, I don't know what kind of thoughts they've got in their head. Aren't they a bit sus? And aren't those people, that it's like it's either a gradual
they're
or
French, aren't they? For the most part,
that?
they're French, and the French nation is majority so-called white. I mean, is that really all they've got, is that these people are French? Does that?
Oh, I'm not. I haven't seen leftists specifically smearing the truckers, but this is my prediction.
I mean, the French workers.
Right? It's coming.
Yeah.
I mean,
and this is what's going to happen. I think if something rises up, not only will I don't think I'm going to lead a revolution. I'm under no illusions about that. But I want to be there, and I want to learn and understand and join the fight.
Yeah.
And that's the most that I would hope for. I don't know.
Okay, so let's talk about Black Lives Matter for just a moment, or the protests that emerged after George Floyd was murdered, because it fundamentally isn't different from the protests that are going on in France now, right? It was not created by some left group. It was a spontaneous reaction by working class people to their perceived interests. The pot boiled over. They hit the streets. They made their perspective known. They rioted. That's what's happening in France, is my understanding. And sort of riots going on and protests, and the left came in. Okay, we were there. The left was involved in Black Lives Matter protests directly. We, on various parts of the left, tried to do different things, but young leftists tried to create anarchist cells to help organize the continuation of the protests, to hold on to the riots, to keep them going. Democratic operatives tried to transform the energy of that into a campaign slogan for changing policy within the Democratic Party, and a variety of other things went on as well.
So here's
Go
where
ahead.
I would flip it.
Okay.
Right. So far I sounded like, an anarchist, right? But let me flip it and say
Okay.
there are going to be riots, there are going to be protests, there are going to be popular uprisings. It's not going to amount to anything. So what do we want it to
Well, I mean, in
become?
this case in France, it might amount to him not raising the age of retirement.
Maybe.
Yeah, it might
Or he
amount to
might
that.
just push it through because, the politicians have figured out what they can get away with. They can get away with a lot.
Mhm.
Right.
Especially in the EU. I mean, they're trying to insulate themselves from as much democratic decision making as possible. Hence, that Macron can bang on and on about the rule of law when it comes to like
maintains a parliamentary majority for raising the retirement age. They're going to do it no matter how many people riot on the street.
No. That's the thing, is that he's bypassed it. That's the point. He doesn't even need it.
He doesn't need that. Okay.
Yeah.
But but let me.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he did this illegally against the parliament. That's
he
the
did
reason
it
why.
within his ambit, I guess. I mean, I guess it's within his rights to propose this.
He triggered a special article that allows him to evade democratic decision making. He specifically did that.
Yeah.
So let me just flip to the
way that Obama did with immigration.
Oh, sure.
Years, right. With the presidential order to change the immigration law. Right.
DACA.
Yes. Yeah. The same mechanism, same kind of mechanism.
So yeah, I would just say I agree with Stephen here. Black Lives Matter and the French riots are not the same. They're not the same. But let's just say, I'm just going to say in general.
How are they different? Just quickly, Chris. How would you differentiate them?
Well, I mean, I hate to say it, but I will say it. The Black Lives Matter protests were kind of lumping. And also, the protests were organized by good leftists. I saw that here in Chicago. They were very tame. But then there were riots, and there was looting, and the looting was organized by gangs. In other words, they looted like the top like high-end boutique stores in order to resell things. That wasn't like popular. That was organized by organized crime people, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was not people like getting food from the grocery store. It was not, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that what's happening in France is broader based, and then Black Lives Matter.
Okay.
And so the thing is, so if I say the lumpen and whatever, right? They're people.
I will say too.
Right.
Explicitly material. Like, although BLM obviously came from something material, this is also more specifically, at least it grows directly out of a material, broad-based kind of assumption, as opposed to something that was kind of, again, I hate to say this, more identity and specific.
Yeah.
But also in France, there's
which is necessary, I have to say.
Well, a lot of white people.
The justification for it politically is the fact that Macron went beyond his power and had to use emergency powers to get what should have been.
I mean, let me just say, if we go back to like a kind of older framework, like a Habermas, like legitimation crisis, right? Mm-hmm. And so those things happen. I mean, I'm just taking the 1,000-year view,
right?
I'm taking the Martian view on the humans down here, which is riots are going to happen, uprisings are going to happen, even revolutions are going to happen. And revolutions meaning like regime change. Like, in other words, this like popular uprising in France might bring Macron down as president. It might, right? That, and that's going to be called a revolution because that's the language that capitalist politicians use. And, like if the people rise up and cause someone to resign, that's a revolution, isn't it? Obviously, Marxists have a different sense of like a social revolution. Mm-hmm. So let me put my Leninist hat on for a second and just say riots are going to happen. Uprisings are going to happen. These things are going to happen, no doubt. But the question is, and even like democratic revolutions in this way are going to happen, that are broad-based, popular revolutions. how are we going to turn it into a socialist revolution? How are we going to turn it in the direction of socialism? And that's where you need to be organized beforehand, and really organized beforehand. Like, in other words, not just a group of people with some ideas, but you're going to need like working class people to have self-organized, educated themselves about social reality, learned how to organize themselves and others to do something like replace the state when the state loses its legitimacy and breaks down, right? To keep order when the police withdraw from the streets, right?
Mhm.
That's a revolution, right? And it's a socialist revolution from a Marxist perspective if that organization is based in the working class that can grasp, like seize the means of production and, all these things, right? Can actually get at like some ability to affect the core activity and dynamic of society. And that's going to take, here, it's going to take decades to organize people.
I don't doubt that.
Right.
Because, look, I don't doubt that, because I remember I was just talking to Ben Burgess about the need for a divorce from the Democrats. And he was saying, well, what are we going to do? Have a third party if we can't change the course of the Democrats, we can't influence the Democratic Party.
About them?
What are our chances of actually having a successful third party develop? And I said, my response was, well, after the defeat of the Paris Commune, the First International broke up, and everyone went underground, and they were forced underground, and they organized, and they wrote, and they thought, and they developed their ideas and the relationships with the working class for like, was it 30 years, 20 years?
Yeah, almost 30 years.
Yeah. Before there was the Second International was formed, before a new, organized effort took hold.
Oh, between the First and the Second International is probably less than 20 years, because I think
just
it's
a little
like
less. Yeah,
because 1889, it's on the centenary of 1789. Is the Second International.
And it was 1871 when the commune
started breaking up. It didn't. The first, the commune was in 1871, and then the First International went into some crisis soon after that.
Right, like it was 70. Yeah. It was like 74 or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, right. But okay, so I was counting from 71, and it was about 20 years. But whatever, right? And so that's a long time to seemingly be dormant. But they weren't dormant.
They were not dormant. They were
Right.
not. They were doing, something that is basically invisible. In other words, we have very scant historical records of it, but we do have some. And again, like grassroots organizing. The problem is grassroots organizing for what? So there's a lot of grassroots organizing that is going on, and that will go on. But for what end? And that's the role of the socialist intelligentsia, the socialist intellectuals, is to keep the goal in mind, even though the goal is not like immediately applicable to what's going on now. The point is, in a variety of ways, on a host of different issues, different aspects of social reality, people have to learn to organize themselves, provide for themselves, deal with things, take advantage of the things that are there, both within like private capitalism and within like the state, but independent enough of it that you're not dependent in what you're doing ultimately on the capitalists doing this or that, or the state doing this or that. Right? And that's where I feel like we're very much stuck in a rut. That's where I think organized labor, for example, needs to be reorganized, refounded from the bottom up. Like, you can't just use the existing unions as they are.
That's happening.
Right.
Chris Smalls created an alternative to the traditional labor union structure in order to get, I don't know where that's ended up now, but
that's what's necessary.
Yeah.
And it can be done. It can be done, and it will be done. In other words, it will be done by non-socialists, or maybe by socialists.
No, Chris Smalls was not a leftist. He was not leftist. He wasn't a rightist, but he was just a working class guy with, you know, his own ambitions. He was a hip hop artist and a warehouse worker, and, you know, charismatic guy. And so he when COVID happened, he organized a walkout on his own initiative. And then when he got an opportunity, he created some sort of labor organization that was not part of the
So here's another caveat that I'll put out there. So of course that kind of working class organizing is great because it's very concrete. It's very much about like the situation, which is like Amazon warehouse workers have to do something. But what was mentioned by one of the viewers in the chat that you put on the screen was single issue campaigns. And so that's the other thing with protest politics, right? Is that it was around single issue campaigns. And I kind of feel like, well, you can't really organize people that way because it's too much about the issue, right? And so it's kind of like, you know, so we'll use the France example, which is there's this issue, raising the retirement age. But clearly people are on the street about more than that. But it's like, will it dissipate if the issue is cleared up? Right? Of course it will dissipate because the people weren't like organized ahead of time. Or insofar as they were, like insofar as existing organizations are participating, those existing organizations from a socialist perspective are probably not fit for the task and are, you know, I guess suspect, you know, in other words, like if like the existing labor unions, you know, join the protests, right? It's like, well, that's to be welcomed, but it's also a problem, right? Because actually what's needed is a new way of organizing that the existing organizations, the legacy organizations, have not addressed, and why they've been reduced to a kind of ineffectiveness. I mean, my problem with like a Ben Burgess or the DSA or Jacobin, they're looking for a shortcut. There's no shortcut, right? And they are saying, well, what are you going to do, right? You're going to read Marx and talk about value theory. You're going to be in a cult with Chris Cutrone. What's the alternative to pushing progressive Democrats? Well, there is another alternative, right? Like you don't have to just read value theory or be in a cult with Chris Cutrone and Platypus. You can, in fact, you know, hunker down for a decades-long slog, right? Where you are going to have to like figure out what people's capacities are on the ground that are not being met already, that are not immediately enlisted into the capitalist NGO, like the Democratic Party's NGO network. Because, you know, like here in like Chicago, right? It's like, it's a hyper-organized city in a way, but it's also a completely unorganized city. In other words, there are all these things on this issue and that issue and these grievances, and it all like lines up with the one party state, the Democrats. But it's also very decrepit. It's very old. Like that stuff was established a long time ago. And it was established when things were a certain way. And in fact, there's a whole layer of reality that is not really touched by any of that stuff. And that's really where the organizing has to be done. And, you know, so, you know, the other stuff that we were doing in New York, as well as here in Chicago with the Campaign for a Socialist Party, was like immigrant rights. So if you think about like how do illegal immigrants, how do undocumented workers, how do those communities function? Right? Because they do. Right? And, you know, where it's like, you know, and they don't just function because Chicago is a sanctuary city. It doesn't matter whether it's a sanctuary city or not, right? They function. Right. And they function through religious organizations. They function through like gangs. They function through. Like,
yeah, I was going to say they
right?
in the underground economy and through their relationships with various nonprofits, churches, other civic society or civil society organizations.
Right. And so socialists have to sort of be there and start establishing networks and it's like cadre building. You know, I hate to say it also, like the first step is a kind of cadre building, which is to say it's not just about like serving the people. It's not like that. It's more like, first of all, we have to educate ourselves as socialists about social reality. And we might be able to help and serve a facilitating function to some degree. But first of all, we need to train ourselves how to deal with people and what's the nature of things. How do things actually function? How do capitalist enterprises, corporations, how does the state, how do the police, how does the bureaucracy, how do these things actually work? But then it's cadre building, meaning it is about like long-term socialist militant organizers, and they are going to be like kind of ideologically a little bit underground. In other words, they are going to be like not just like with a bullhorn on a soapbox with a TikTok video, like "Hello, I'm a socialist." Right? It's just not going to be like that,
Don't
right?
knock my TikTok videos.
But you know, like,
I want, you know, in today's social media era, every leftist wants to be Mario Savio. I know I do. So, you know, maybe that's not how it's.
Well, you know,
I mean, there are protests to be had, but again, it's kind of like towards what end and what is it really about? And you know, the new left, there were leftist organizations, leftist parties, like, you know, France, the French New Left. There's a French Communist Party. There's a French Socialist Party. There are these Trotskyist groups that have tens of thousands of members in France in the 60s, right? There's like something. And of course, that's like an advantage. It's also a disadvantage. Now it's like, oh shit, there's nothing. Well, guess what? That's the opportunity. That's the opportunity. And
see,
so
that was the thing that I wanted to say. Where I just flashed on the screen Steve Roberts, who said new working class movements may be constituted spontaneously, but around what political content, goal, task? We've had spontaneity for 100 years. I know, and I knew that when I said, you know, I think something will probably erupt, because I know that I understand leaderlessness and spontaneity is also defunct, but so is our party organizing. There's nothing here now, right? And so we have a
we need to know is the Labour Party, the New Democratic Party, you know, the Democratic Party. So the New Democrats are the Canadian Party, and the Democratic Party. The first thing that we have to know is this has nothing to do with any of them. At all. In other words, totally independent of them. Completely independent of them. And, you know, in other words, you know, individual people can vote for whoever they want based on whatever they want. Right? But we're talking about something that's independent of any of that. Right? So it's not about like telling people, oh, don't vote. It doesn't matter. Like, in other words, it's about how you need to be organized in such a way that what goes on there doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Even though we're living in like a catastrophic time and everything going on, COVID lockdowns, World War III. No, the 1,000-year view. You know, what are our activities going to look like to historians 1,000 years from now? What was going on?
I admire your optimism that there will be 1,000 years from now.
Well, there will be, Ashley. Come on. Humans are going to be there. They might be living in a very wretched state from our perspective. They might be floating in orbit around the Earth over a you know, toxic planet. They're going to be there. You know, it might be like The Expanse. They might be out in the asteroid belt, like carrying on the class struggle. You know.
No, for God's sake.
no, I mean, right? But so, I mean, no, right? Let's hope not. But what I'm saying is, like, again, it's a hard one, right? It's like reproductive freedom. Can we have reproductive freedom regardless of what the law is? Well, guess what? What do you think people have been doing for hundreds of years? Right? Like, it's like, do you know, like the law? Like, what? You know? I mean, maybe it's because I'm gay and I just know like 100 years ago people were gay even though it was totally illegal to be gay. But people still organized their communities and their subcultures, and they just lived. They carried on. They did, right? I don't know.
Just like it was illegal to be a socialist for a while.
Yes, and it's going to be. In other words, as soon as we get serious, it will be illegal.
Okay, and it will be people that are now calling themselves leftists who help push.
I was
Oh,
just
yeah.
thinking, I was like, oh,
You
and
know,
I wonder
one
who it'll
thing-
be.
Because I
This is my
actually,
prediction, if I can just
okay,
say.
go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
Anything that has any potential of being properly subversive, I can guarantee will be destroyed by people who currently
Well,
call
they will
themselves
try
leftists.
to, but again, the point will
Will try
be
to,
be
yes.
organized in such a way that they can't.
Hmm.
That they can't, because they can't. They can't. It's just like they can't stop the drug cartels. They can't. Socialists are going to be organized like that, right? They can't destroy the mafia. The socialists have to be resilient like that. You know, the Roman Empire could not suppress Christianity. It's got to be like that.
I don't think we should accept as a foregone conclusion that being a socialist will become illegal in the West.
Oh, you don't think that that's a foregone conclusion? It already is.
I didn't. Yeah,
it already is. I mean,
but right now, like, okay, but around the Twitter files, for instance, right? There's now an opportunity for a lot of the rights that have been slowly usurped over decades to be taken back. I fear
that Matt Taibbi might end up imprisoned. I mean, look at Julian Assange. Look at who's Edward Snowden.
Well, yeah.
Chelsea Manning. I mean, obviously Chelsea Manning was in a position of vulnerability, like a military person leaking information, right? But like Julian Assange, like, why is he in jail?
Yeah.
At all?
There's no justification for Assange.
Right, and yet there he is.
None. No, I know, but he's
it's because
he's Australian and he's in jail in the United States, right? Something like I don't know. He's not protected somehow. I don't know. Yeah, you're right. Assange is that's the frog boiling right there is Assange. But the point is, like, right now the response to Taibbi and Barry Weiss and Michael Schellenberger and Li Fang and the Twitter files has been to rebrand their efforts and to retract some of the plans and to go through the internet and delete not only from their own websites but from the Wayback Machine of records of all the things that they had been planning on doing to fight disinformation, they say.
No, the internet, I mean, I hate to say it, you know, again, I'm going to sound like a total anarchist, like total. I'm just like, the internet is horrible. It's a control mechanism. We should not use it we should not depend on it as much as we do. In other words, we can use it as much as we can use it. But like a socialist party, like if it depends on internet access, we're finished. We're finished, right? Because they can turn it off with a switch. I mean, very easily. It's very clear, right? And so the internet ain't what it used to be. You know, like you used to be able to find anything on the internet, and now you can't find anything.
Everybody get your radios.
Well, I mean, we're on the internet right now. People found us, you know,
because right now it's harmless. What I'm saying is we have to become dangerous again. And that's going to not be by having an extreme position and calling for extreme immediate action, like direct action, like kill this person, blow up that thing. It's not going to be that. No, that's not really dangerous at all. That's not a threat to the system at all. When you start organizing people, then you're a threat. Right?
Yeah. No, I agree.
I think also this point about, I know we need to go, but this point about the Twitter files is really important because one of the things that is sort of lurking in the background that was the whole point of this month's sort of inquiry into the revolutionary subject was
let's bring it back to that. Yes.
You can't have a left without that subject, because this is what happens. If you don't trust humanity, if you don't believe in any, if you think your purpose is to kind of protect a vulnerable kind of working class subject from harm, then you have no position.
A lot of this is
in
middle
freedom.
class.
You will never stand up for these sorts of things because you think people are weak and need to be protected. But that also means if people are weak and need to be protected, they can't be freed because that freedom is risky.
I mean, can I say this? This is like going to sound like maybe nasty or something, but I feel like, okay, my middle class students who are all on psychopharmaceuticals and who are all very managed and who are very like neutralized, you know, working class people who are working, they're not. They don't have access. They're not medicalized because they're just not. I mean, they might be medicalized if they're put in jail or something like that, but, or, if they're put in a psychiatric hospital. But like in terms of like the functioning of society, the warehouse workers are not on all psychological medication. They're not. Like all of my students might be, but the workers are not. Right. And so, in other words, is there a bourgeois subject? Are there individuals making choices? Of course. Like the society could not function without that. Right. In other words, like this idea that like, oh, we're all becoming like manipulated, psychotropic nodes in the matrix. The middle class, maybe.
Well, here's the thing. And then the middle class starts to advocate for the expansion and democratization of their own lobotomization. Because that's what they're like. Oh, and it's the worst thing. You see this all over. They're like, it's the worst thing that we do not have this, it's an inequality in the world where they have access to these new treatments and poor people don't.
This idea
that's
that
the World Health Organization
you can't have an identity or a sexuality or a life until you have hormone treatments and surgeries. I mean, people are living, they're carrying on, right? And, and again, we have to look at it broadly. The world working class, right? People around the world are not this, right? They're not. And so we have like our middle class universe, we do. And again, like I have my students who I'm going to go teach now. My family doesn't belong to the class of people who would ever be in my classroom as students.
Yeah, mine either.
They would never be, right? And so I just know that there's a whole wide world out there. That's the world that has to make socialism.
Well,
that will, before we blow it all up.
Yeah. Listen, this was a really good conversation. I feel like that we should dig in on this a bit more, that this is not the end of this at all.
No.
I'm going to be talking about Promethean socialism and Prometheus and Marx in the next couple of days as well. So watch out for that.
All right. So people who would like to continue talking to Ashley and I can go to Patreon. We'll be putting up a link to the live stream there. $5 a month helps out a lot. Keep us funded while we're still legal. And we'll see you at Patreon.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around